So, good afternoon, everybody. I think BEREC has a lot of deliverables this year. We want to deliver them on time, so I'll try and start the debrief exactly on time as well. So, welcome to everybody who's present here, and also to anybody who is dialing in and watching us on video. So this is our first public debrief of 2019. It follows the BEREC plenary that we held last week in Budapest. I'll just introduce the people who will be speaking. So Elizabeth and Joanna are the co-chairs of the Roaming Expert Working Group, and they will do the debriefing on the intra-EU calls. And Bert and Bo, the co-chairs of the Planning and Future Trends Expert Working Group, will be talking about the planning process. Maybe we can have the next slide. Thanks. So the things we're going to talk about today, as I said, we'll have the guidelines on intra-EU communications were published on Monday. Some stakeholders had asked us to get them out as early as possible so they could be digested for internal stakeholder meetings this week. We want to talk about the process for developing BEREC work programs because not only have we've adapted the process because we're being to move on to a multi-annual approach, but part of that, in implementing that process, there will be shortly a call for inputs for the 2020 work programme. So we want to make sure that you're aware of what's happening there. I'll talk a little bit about some of the additional reports that were adopted at plenary, and then under any other business, again, talk about some stakeholder engagement, talk about a piece of early input we're asking for on the VHCN definition guidelines, and gives you some of the highlights from the roaming benchmark data report. So, the first piece. So I should also say that if I may ask you to write down questions that you have and keep them, because I think in deference to the people who are watching from video, it's probably more convenient to take questions on all the topics at the end rather than as we go along. So if you would mind holding your questions till the end. So before I hand over to Elizabeth and Joanna, I want to say these are the first guidelines that BEREC has produced, not so much under the code but under the regulation, but as part of the new telecoms legislation. We worked very hard to do this. The expert working group worked very hard. I think was it Oliver asked me 2 debriefs ago whether we would cover more than just the question of derogations, and I said if you want us to, let us know, and stakeholders let us know, and so we did. And I think that so not only was the work done very quickly, it's also been a broader scope than was strictly required by the code. And we also had the innovation of a stakeholder workshop, an early stakeholder workshop, to gather inputs as a practical way of doing things given the time frame. So I think at the plenary there was a lot of appreciation for the work of the expert working groups as led by the co-chairs, and I'd like to acknowledge that great achievement. And now, but you're probably more interested in the substance of the guidelines, so I will pass on to Elizabeth and Joanna to take you through that.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Before coming to the content of the guidelines, I would like to repeat a little bit what the legal provisions of the intra-EU communications regulations are. So as of 15th of May 2019, price caps on regulated intra-EU communication services will apply, which are 19 € excluding value-added tax per minute for calls and 6 € excluding value-added tax per SMS message. NRAs can grant a derogation from the price caps if the provider can demonstrate against the relevant benchmark that it is significantly more affected than most other providers in the Union, or that it may that impact would significantly weaken the provider's capacity to maintain its domestic charging model. BEREC therefore has to publish guidelines on the parameters to be taken into account by the NRAs in their derogation assessments. In addition to that, NRAs have to monitor also the market and the price developments for regulated intra-EU communications, and we also have to report to the Commission on that. So what are the guidelines now about? the first part of the guidelines, as Jeremy said, the guidelines include not only provisions about the derogation, but also some general provisions. And the general guidelines refer to, first of all, the scope of the regulation. So which kind of services are covered by the regulation, that are fixed voice services, mobile voice services, and SMS services, independently from which handsets the calls are made. With regard to the types of tariffs, that are tariffs that are addressed to consumers, so only consumer tariffs are covered, and tariffs that are wholly or partially based on actual consumption. With regard to the geographical scope, the regulation applies to EU member states, including the outermost regions, which are part of the EU single market. We learned from the roaming guidelines that it was not always clear which kind of outermost regions are concerned by the regulation, so we included a link to latest jurisdictions on that. Furthermore, the regulation also applies to Iceland, Liechtenstein, and Norway, but only when it's incorporated in the EEA agreement. We also provide some details about charging intervals. There is no specific requirements in the regulation to apply specific charging intervals for the operators. So as long as it's not more than the 60 seconds, charging intervals are fine. The regulation, the guidelines already also refer to tariffs that include setup fee for calls. Here we say that setup fees are okay as long as the total cap per minute is not exceeded. With regard to alternative tariffs, they can be offered in addition to the regulated tariff, so to the default tariff, but operators before the 15th of May have to inform the consumers that there are in such a tariff, and the consumers need to explicitly express their view to stay in those alternative tariffs. If they don't do so, operators have to switch them automatically to the default tariffs on the 15th of July. Last but not least, on the general guidelines, they also refer to value-added services. Here we apply the same principles as we do in the roaming guidelines. So the price cap does not apply to value-added service, but only to the tariff component of the value-added service. And now I hand over to Jana to explain you the derogation.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Taking into account the legal provision, BEREC has concluded that the assessment should be performed in two steps. First, the benchmark comparison is required, and if this test is fulfilled, the NRA will need to assess the impact on the domestic pricing model of the applicant. Regarding the benchmark, BEREC has concluded that this benchmark should be calculated using the volumes of intra-EU communication services. A separate benchmark for fixed, mobile, and SMS is foreseen, which will be calculated as a proportion of regulated intra-EU over volume for each service. According to BEREC, the 95th percentile should be used as the relevant threshold in order to define the benchmark. And finally, BEREC has concluded that the benchmark needs to be updated on a yearly basis, as because of the regulation there might be changes in the consumption of intra-EU communication services. For the first year, the calculation is based on the intra-EU data that BEREC collected last year for a relevant exercise. Coming now to the second test, BEREC concluded that for this assessment, the NRA receiving an application will need to compare the impact on the regulated intra-EU communication margins with the total margin from electronic communication services. BEREC has decided that a different threshold should be used for negative and positive margin from regulated intra-EU communication services. In particular, we proposed to have a 3% in case of a negative margin and a 9% for the case of positive margin. Regarding the more practical issues of this test, the applicant operators will have the burden of proof by providing all the required data. And similarly to the roaming derogation, we have prepared templates to be used by the applicant operators. In case a derogation application is accepted, the NRA needs to decide on the maximum price level in excess of the price caps. We are proposing that surcharges can be applied to all intra-EU communication services, not only to the ones that satisfy the benchmarking test. In addition, we have concluded that the surcharges should be proposed by operators, taking into account the output of the second test, as well as the volume of the various services. NRAs will then examine their proposal and proceed with the required authorization. Regarding the procedure and the deadlines that need to be followed, we are proposing to follow the roaming derogation approach. In particular, NRAs will have 1 month to examine each application, which could be extended by 2 more months in case there are incomplete applications. And each derogation would be granted for 12 months, subject to a new application for renewal. Finally, in case of an authorization, operators should comply with any of their national rules regarding transparency or changes in terms and conditions. Another issue that is discussed in our guidelines is the tasks under NRAs and BEREC's monitoring. We have concluded that the best way forward is to have a common template and collect data regarding the number of subscribers separately for consumers and businesses, the volumes per service for domestic and intra-EU communication services separately for regulated alternative tariffs and bundles, and the revenues from intra-EU communication services, again separately for regulated and alternative tariffs. BEREC will aggregate the data and publish a report on the findings of this exercise. Last but not least, we would like to thank you for all the inputs we received during the workshop we had on the 29th of January 2019. And before closing this presentation on intra-EU calls, we would like to show you a video that we have prepared for end users regarding both intra-EU communication services and roaming services. And you can find this video on BEREC's website.
Aren't mobile phones great? Tom and Emily certainly think so. They can make calls and send SMS wherever they want to. But there is something Tom and Emily must be aware of. If they use their mobile phones abroad, they are roaming. If they are calling or sending SMS from home into another country, they make international calls or send international SMS. BEREC, the body of European regulators for electronic communications, help to make both roaming as well as international calls and SMS cheaper for you. BEREC provided crucial input to the European Commission to introduce Roam Like at Home and the Intra-EU Calls and SMS regulation. Both are valid within the European Union, Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway. Altogether called the EEA, the European Economic Area. Roam Like at Home lets you enjoy your mobile phone while traveling just as if you were at home. You can use the minutes, SMS and data included in your tariff in the EEA at no extra cost. After consumption of the included minutes, SMS and data, only your domestic prices will be charged. Ask your operator to tell you your exact limits and exemptions. When entering another EEA country, your operator will send you an automatic message telling you the basic pricing information. Additionally, the operator warns you when you roam outside your included limits and have reached a €50 threshold, excluding value-added tax. This is especially important for roaming outside the EEA, or when you travel by plane, cruise ship or ferry using their satellite connection. Then the benefits of Roam Like at Home are not applicable. But what about when you're at home and want to contact somebody in another EEA country? Now you can call and send SMS all over Europe at cheaper rates thanks to the regulation of Intra-EU Calls and SMS from mid-May 2019. With Intra-EU Calls, your telephone conversations via mobile phone or landline from home into the EEA countries don't cost more than €19 per minute, excluding value-added tax. And Intra-EU SMS don't cost more than €6 each, excluding value-added tax. So whether you are traveling or staying at home, it has never been cheaper to stay connected with your family and friends in Europe. This is all thanks to the introduction of Roam Like at Home and the Intra-EU calls and SMS regulation.
So thank you very much to Elizabeth and Joanna. I might also say that the presentation will be available or is available on the BEREC website. So feel free to take photographs of the slides, but it's not entirely necessary if you will be able to get the presentation itself. I'm now going to hand over to Bo and Bert. As I said before, we used to have a somewhat ad hoc process for putting together the work programme led by the incoming chair, but now we're moving to multi-annual programming. We've put in place a new working group on planning and future trends, so that we have a consistent process from year to year, and so that we can plan projects that start in one year and finish in the next year, or we can plan projects where we maybe do a report one year and a common position the next year, to enable us to do that kind of thing. So we want to share with you the new programme. There's a transition. This year is a transition year, so some of the timeframes are being a little bit compressed, so we can get started. And Bo and Bert will tell you about that now. So over to you, Bo and Bert.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Good afternoon, everyone. As Jeremy said, this is a transitional year, and we are now moving to, instead of having a one-year horizon in the work program, we're going to multi-annual work program, and we're aiming at having about 3-year horizon in this. And in order to be transparent and to see how this looks and how we will work in this process, we would like to share this with you, of course, and also in order to make sure that we point out there are possibilities for stakeholders to interact in this process. And moving in this way comes really natural now, since we have several final deliverables in this year's 2019 work program that will be delivered in 2020, particularly those guidelines that will be working out in that way. And there are a few key principles that are captured in this new process. And as I mentioned, it's really important to, and as Jeremy mentioned, that the early engagement with stakeholders is really important. We try to increase these possibilities for stakeholders to come in this process here, in this change. And in order to have what we call an institutional memory, to not start with, we have not really a blank piece of paper each year, but really to make sure that we keep what we bring forward over the years into the new working programs each year. We have now the new working group, Planning and Future Trends, where this is one of the work streams within this working group. And it's also a way of making sure that we meet the requirements to submit outlines to the Parliament and the EU institutions that we have to do. And also to get regular updates and feedback from the Board of Regulators. And as Jeremy mentioned, we are doing this shift, means that we have to make some kind of transitional journey over this year in the process of developing the 2020 work program. And but we aim at, in doing this, we've already in a bit to this process, but the aim is still here to make sure that we get to open the possibilities for earlier engagement than before. The next slide, please. And just to point at, in this new process, there are two moments of key interactions that is possible for stakeholders, and it's in over. Bert will describe this more in detail, but in December and January there are call for input from stakeholders for work programs for the subsequent years. So in that part of the year we ask for input for the year after. And at the BEREC Annual Stakeholder Forum in September and also into October, it will be open for public consultation on the next year's work program. So we try to make this as early as possible when the Stakeholder Forum is, and to make sure that there is enough time for everyone to get input to us for the upcoming year. So with this, I'll leave to Bert to continue to more in detail describe this process.
Thank you, Bo. Yeah, let's quickly take a look at the timeline. I don't have a button. I presume someone else will click every year. Yeah. Great. So we start the year in December and ask for input from stakeholders, from you. By asking you this early, we can also use your contributions for the outline we have to present for the EU institutions. And by inviting you this early, you will have more influence on what we're going to choose and how to prioritize. Instead of being asked only at the end, you can give your early inputs in December already. The following steps will be more within BEREC. In February, we'll do some consolidation and initial prioritization to prepare for plenary 1. There we will present the inputs and what we made of it, and we will select at the plenary we will select the projects that we're going to do the next year. The projects that we won't choose will automatically be placed on the multi-annual agenda and will be reconsidered the years after. Because some projects we identify may be brought forward by you, may be brought forward by others, may be considered more relevant in a year later than in the next year that we program. So that this new working group will keep all your input in stock for a number of years, so they won't be forgotten. At P2, the plenary 2, we will get the final steer from the Board of Regulators on our program, and we will use for that the consideration of priorities from the Council, European Parliament and European Commission. In September we will we will have the draft working program ready, and then it is ready for public consultation. It is new to start with it in September. Normally we start with a stakeholder forum in October. We try to do it earlier in September. This year we don't know yet, because since this procedures we come in the middle of the procedure now. You have not been able to give your input this year, so we will ask you very soon, probably in March already. So this timeline will be compressed a bit, and we may need a little extra time to prioritize your suggestions, and hopefully we can be ready by September. Otherwise we'll do it again like previous years with the stakeholder forum in October. In December, after your second input, we will finalize the working program for the next year, and at the same time we will again call for new input for the year after. It's a bit of a puzzle, but we're happy to explain and elaborate.
Thanks very much, Bert and Bo. Bert told me that the two of them have got this job not just because of the skills they have, but because their names are very appropriate. It's something I think they call in English nominative determinism. So Bo's name, of course, stands as the initials of the BEREC office. And Bert told me that there was once a proposal for a Bureau Européen pour la régulation de télécommunications, which also would stand for Bert. So they had no choice but to take on these tasks. I think their whole lives have been leading up to this moment. I might also just comment one thing about the call for inputs, just to share some experience that ComReg had last year on the call for inputs, which is sometimes stakeholders told us about problems they saw and said BEREC should do something about this. That's obviously a useful piece of input, but the most useful pieces were where people said, translated that into kind of BEREC speak and said, we think it would be useful if BEREC were to do a report on X, or were to develop guidelines on Y or adopt a common position on Z. So I think to the greatest extent, if you're able to, in a way, specify what BEREC deliverable you'd like to see in the work programme, that will make life a bit easier for us in making sure we actually really understand what it is you think we should be doing. But if you can't do that, by all means, tell us what the problems are, and we'll try to work out what deliverable would best fit. But if you can, if you do have an idea of the deliverables, that actually I think does make the process easier and makes it clearer exactly what it is you're saying. If I can move on then to talk about some of the other reports that were adopted at the plenary. The first is a report on pricing for access to infrastructure and civil works in the context of the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive. The report focused on 3 particular areas of the directive where pricing was relevant, looked at methodologies and decisions, and so forth. I think the general finding was that this is not terribly harmonised across the Union, that the way in which the directive has been transposed in different member states is quite different, is not uniform. I think we found in terms of approaches to pricing, we've actually only had 4 decisions that are reported on in the report. We found that some NRAs had taken the view that fair and reasonable was the same as cost-oriented. Some dispute resolution bodies, it's not necessarily an NRA, because the directive talks about cost recovery. Other dispute resolution bodies are inclined more to look at market benchmarks for what is fair and reasonable. In terms of civil works, we've only had 1 decision, which is in Germany. And in terms of in-building physical infrastructure, we found that there are some member states had regulations in place about this even before the Broadband Cost Reduction Directive, and there are 9 out of the 28 member states and 3 EEA states that have adopted some guidance. So I think what we discovered here is not a lot of commonality, quite a variety of approaches. Thanks. In terms of Internet of Things indicators, we wanted to find out what was currently going on by NRAs in measuring the development of IoT, to see if there was a common set of indicators that could be used, to look at what were the powers that NRAs had in collecting information, and trying to establish why this would be worth collecting in the first place. I think our findings were that, first of all, there isn't a common view of what IoT encompasses. So we, of course, asked NRAs, but we also asked stakeholders what they thought. And there were various suggestions made in terms of are they devices connected to the internet to reach other devices, or does it refer to specialized devices connected through peer-to-peer technologies? Does it mean number-based devices as well? So quite a lot of different views. For machine to machine, we think there is an updated common definition that could be used that's in the report, and that's particularly necessary because the code specifically refers to machine and gives NRAs and BEREC powers to collect information, data about them. The report, I think, also includes a proposal for what indicators might be most usefully collected. Things like the number of connected objects and devices operating in licensed spectrum, operating in unlicensed spectrum, whether they have numbers, whether they don't have numbers, and the traffic generated by those devices. What I think was more difficult was, although it's possible to come up with a list of useful information that could be useful if it was collected, was to then work out how it could in fact be collected. So while it's relatively easier for NRAs to collect data about devices on, say, mobile networks, because there's someone to ask. When you're talking about IoT devices that might be connected to people's home Wi-Fi, it's then much harder to collect data in the same way. And one of the suggestions in this report, as a further piece of work for BEREC, would be to consider during the course of next year how that data might be collected, and that might well involve commissioning market research agencies or other kinds of data collection approaches, rather than just using the kind of traditional powers of asking authorised undertakings to provide data. So that's something. It's easier to say what kind of data you would like. It's much harder to decide to know exactly how you would go about collecting it. But I think it's tempting sometimes just to say focus on the data that's easy to get, even if it's not the data that is most insightful. So we need to do some more work next year about how to turn that wish list of data into something that can practically be collected. And then the last thing to talk about here was the report on termination of contracts and switching providers. So here the objective was to consider some of the factors that are impactful when people terminate contracts and switch, and we wanted to better inform NRAs and better inform consumers about how to maintain and enhance awareness of how to exercise choice. So a lot of BEREC work is about making markets work effectively on the wholesale side, making sure we have competition in supply, but of course there's no point in providing competition if consumers are not able to exercise choice. So this is a very important aspect of making markets work effectively. So we analysed a lot of information about what switching processes were, what rules there were in different member states to facilitate contract terminations and switching, looking both at standalone services, also looking at bundled services. We looked at whether there were charges and fees for termination, what kind of obstacles there were, barriers to switching, and what suggestions there might be for improving the switching process. So I think the main findings were that consumers like a receiving provider-led process. So by and large, what they do is they talk to the receiving provider and they rely on the receiving provider to cancel their existing service with the transferring provider. In most member states, there are rules that relate to the length of the switching period. About half of member states have detailed rules about mis-selling, about slamming, so the practice of moving consumers from one provider to another without proper consent, and also rules about debt. So what do you do, how do you handle the question of if a consumer actually owes money to the transferring provider? And so the report will allow NRAs to compare and contrast the regimes in other jurisdictions. We're not at the moment saying that we should come back to this project next year. We think maybe it's something to come back to prioritise after the code has been transposed. But of course, if stakeholders feel that this is a project that should have more work done by BEREC, then it's open to you to propose that during the call for inputs that Bert and Bo talked about. Thanks. Three other issues to cover. So one is transparency and stakeholder engagement. So we had a second workshop on BEREC's working practices. So that follows on from the one we had 6 months ago in Portoroz. That was, this time we looked particularly at how BEREC communicates with stakeholders and on our approach to transparency. I think on transparency, it's probably worth, I think we can move on to the next slide actually. So on transparency, three things that we decided we would do. One is we want to publish more documents proactively. So to make more information available. There's a bit of work to do to identify which types of documents we should be publishing. So one example that people had was we should publish in advance the kind of project plans and key milestones for the project, so that I think we've had lots of input from stakeholders that they'd like to know when the best time would be to reach out to the EWGs if they had input they wanted to give on an unsolicited basis at an early stage. So to give some of that type of information. Again, I think we reconfirmed the desire to increase engagement. So the new process for the work programme is one method of doing that. I think we've also talked about early engagement on projects through workshops, through questionnaires, through calls for input and so forth, so that there's some engagement with stakeholders before we get to the point of the formal consultation on a draft report or draft guidelines. And we will also be publishing detailed guidelines on how we handle access for document requests. But I think one of our aims is that by being more proactive in publishing documents, then there will be less need for stakeholders to actually make requests for documents under the transparency provisions of European law. And then there are two other things that we kind of decided were quite interesting but want to think about a little bit more. One is a lobbying register or a transparency register. So some of our stakeholders have said they'd really like to know who we're meeting, to make sure that, really to dispel, I think, any suggestion that there are some favoured stakeholder groups. So one way to do that is to be transparent. So one of the things we're thinking about is, for example, publishing on the BEREC website a list of all the meetings that the chair has had with stakeholders and and at a very high level, what topics were discussed. So that's something that I think we want to develop a little bit further, and of course we'd like input from stakeholders on. We'll seek input from stakeholders on whether or not they think that's something that they would support. So far, certainly in informal conversations with stakeholders, it's something people are very used to in terms of their interaction with the Commission and other similar institutions. And then the other thing we want to think about a bit further is the idea of a permanent stakeholders group. So bodies like ENISA have a permanent stakeholders group. The purpose of that group in ENISA is to assist ENISA with the development of their work programme and to assist ENISA in working out how best to communicate with stakeholders, in general. That's not necessarily the same two functions we would have for a stakeholder group in BEREC, but we thought this might be useful, particularly when it comes. I think one of the experiences we had in organising the workshop in January on Intra-EU communications was we really didn't know who to invite, so we made it a completely open public invitation, and we ended up with press there as well as stakeholders. And some stakeholders were maybe a little bit uncomfortable that in such an open forum that the debate might be a bit stilted. So we're thinking a little bit about that feedback and whether or not some form of permanent stakeholder group might help us decide who we could invite to workshops where we could have a more where they would be kind of semi-private. But on the other hand, there are some people in BEREC saying we need to be very careful that we don't create a magic circle of favoured stakeholders as well. So we're thinking a little bit about how to balance those two things. And again, I think we won't before setting this up, we'd certainly engage with stakeholders to see what you thought about the idea. So there's a little bit more work to be done on those two things. Second thing I wanted to talk about under AOB was a piece of early engagement that I think we launched on Monday. So a very important project for BEREC is guidelines on the criteria for defining what a very high capacity network is. So this project is very important because very high capacity networks are referred to in quite a few of the critical provisions of the code, and also one of the new connectivity objective also refers to very high capacity networks. So it's important, I think, for NRAs, for BEREC, for member states, for the Commission to have a good definition of VHCNs. As part of this, the working group that's working on this wants to have a questionnaire to gather some technical information, both from network operators and vendors. And at the moment, before we issue the questionnaire to be filled in, we want to make sure we're asking the right questions. So the first phase of engagement is we've, I think, got a draft questionnaire on the BEREC website, and the working group would like input on whether or not those are the right questions to be asking. And once we've had that input on the questionnaire, we'll then issue the questionnaire and ask people to fill it in. So NRAs will send the questionnaires to operators at national level, but this is really a very important piece of data collection. We'd really like your help to make sure we do get the information that you think we should have. Thanks. And lastly, we're publishing the 22nd International Benchmark Data Report. I think this is very interesting because of the it keeps our fingers on the pulse of what's happening on Roam Like at Home. So we're now, by the time we get to Q3 2018, is that the fifth quarter since Roam Like at Home came in, I think. So we can see that the usage, the data consumption on a per subscriber basis is still increasing. I don't think that can be entirely a seasonal effect, but obviously we'll get, it'll take a while before we get longer trends. But I think the benefits of Roam Like at Home to end users in terms of unlocking what was clearly suppressed demand for usage is very clear. We're also seeing that wholesale prices on average are well below the caps. I think we're also aware that for some operators they're not able to negotiate such good prices. So we've had a lot of input from the MVNOs about that, but on the whole the wholesale prices are continuing to decline. And that is it for the presentation. So thank you very much for your patience in listening, and I will now open the floor for questions. Is it Oliver?
Thank you, Jeremy. Oliver Fuchs from the European Competitive Telecommunications Association. Thank you for presenting the results of last week's plenary to us. I think you covered a wide ground, so I guess it's only fitting that I have questions on a few of the items that you raised. But maybe I'll take them in steps so we can have the responses as the subject matters progress, rather than doing it in a one go, so to speak. So on the Intra-EU comms guidelines, first of all, we of course thank the expert working group for having provided them 2 days early relative to the deadline that was announced in the publication date rather that was announced back in January. I wanted to come back on process, because what we heard from a number of the jurisdictions where our members are present was actually that after the date where the drafting supposedly was to be finished, which was mid-February, some NRAs were still running public consultations, and we wanted to have a bit of clarity on how this was taken into account and what the discussions in the plenary last week actually turned up in terms of further work and how BEREC is going to follow this in terms of any potential questions that may still come up in 2019, despite the guidance now being available. I think there were some issues that had been raised at the workshop in January that I haven't been able to verify in the guidance yet, but that weren't publicly addressed on that occasion. So it would be interesting to know how BEREC sees potentially giving feedback on that. But first and foremost on process, please.
Thanks for the question. I think we have tried to include most of the feedback that we have received during the workshop. Maybe we can, on a bilateral basis, check whether there is still some open questions where you need some more input from our side. I didn't really get the question on what was happening between February and now, or what was exactly meant.
Okay, so to repeat, so as far as we understood, the draft was finalized mid-February for submission to the board. And we understand, or we know, that certain NRAs still conducted public consultations with their domestic operators after that time. And so my question is, how does that fit with the drafting process, and how were these results of those consultations taken into account?
Maybe I can just talk about the BEREC decision-making process. So the working group produces a draft that goes to the contact network. When was the contact network meeting? Mid-February. So the contact network was in mid-February. So what happens with a draft that goes to the contact network is there's discussion in the contact network about, so issues can be raised then, and then it's also a possibility for written comments to be made by NRAs in the week after the contact network meeting. And so any input that was provided at the contact network meeting or afterwards would then be taken into account by the working group in revising and refining the guidelines before submitting it to the Board of Regulators for final approval. So the final approval would have been submitted about 10 days before the plenary. And at that point, it's always possible that at the plenary there's further discussion and refinements to be made. I think in this case there wasn't any refinement necessary as a result of discussion in the plenary. Obviously NRAs can give input at all those points. So that what they're doing domestically with their own operators, in order to prepare themselves for participation in the BEREC decision-making process, is obviously something that each NRA does. Just in terms of your other question, as Elizabeth said, it'd be good to hear bilaterally any further unanswered questions. Of course, it's been a very accelerated process, so if there are new things that are not adequately addressed, or things that in the course of experience in implementing it you think ought to be addressed, then that's again something that in the context of next year's work programme, or even if you think it's more urgent, give us that input bilaterally. But it's always the possibility of doing further work on any BEREC thing. If that's what stakeholders think is necessary, we're always open to those suggestions.
Okay, thank you very much. Then on the work program process that Bo and Bert presented. So if I understood it correctly, there is an idea that those projects that will not be prioritized for inclusion in the next work program year will be kept on hold in one way or another. How do you intend to make that public? Is there going to be some type of register or some communication on what will happen with these projects? Because obviously the question for us also is, and I guess everybody else around the room has provided input on previous occasions, is there a rolling register already now, and are these projects being reconsidered at this moment? What evolution are we going to see in terms of treating stakeholder proposals for work projects to be taken on?
So I think Bert and Bo talked about a multi-annual process. So the idea is that we will have, obviously the next year's work programme has to be firm because we have to do it, but then for the subsequent years we'll have kind of a list of possible projects that are in the job jar. So those might be ones that stakeholders had suggested and that we think are good projects but not a priority for the current year, and we might have them as potential projects for future years. Or they might be projects that come out of BEREC work, where the team doing the work says, well, we finished this and we think we should come back, here's a set of guidelines, we should revise these in 3 years' time. Or it might be that we've done, say, as we did on the IoT indicators, we've done a report and we think we should develop a certain aspect of it further. So the BEREC work program won't just be a one-year work program. We'll also have I think the idea is we'll have candidate projects for future years. But whilst the next year's work program will be written in ink, the future years projects are definitely in pencil. So I think when it comes to comment on the work program, you'll already have the previous year's multi-annual program as one of the pieces you can use in giving your in responding to the December-January call for inputs. So that's how to work. I think in terms of, I'm not sure we've got things that stakeholders produced last year that we've got on our radar for next year. You'll probably need to have those again. Propose those again would be kind of useful, I think.
So then, if I may continue with one more question, which is actually not among the items that you presented today, but which figured on the plenary's agenda, was agenda item 4 on the participation of NRAs from non-EU jurisdictions. The press has reported that apparently there were even potential amendments to the rules of working inside BEREC, which apparently led to exclusion of notably the Swiss regulator participating in meetings. And I haven't been able to trace any such changes, so could you please elaborate on what has happened and how you're seeing this evolving, and specifically, has that had any repercussions on the participation of the ESA in BEREC meetings? Thank you.
So I think the thing to say is we have a new BEREC regulation that came into force in December. Unlike the old regulation had provided for participation of observer NRAs in BEREC. The new regulation has something that they call participants without voting rights, and there's a somewhat more formal process for enrolling an NRA for an NRA to become a participant without voting rights. It's a little bit of a shame that the legislators didn't provide for a transition, for a smoother transition. But BEREC is a mere servant of the law. We do what the regulation says. So the former observer states, which were the EEA states, Switzerland, I think, and some of the states, and the accession states, were all observers in BEREC before, and it's necessary for them now to become participants without voting rights, and that requires the Commission to take some steps because the regulation says that there has to be an agreement. A suitable agreement between the union and the country that the NRA comes from. So that's all going on at the moment, and we're hoping that in the case of most of the former observer NRAs, that will be completed soon, relatively quickly. In the meantime, in order for to provide continuity, we've invited individuals from We've invited all the kind of the heads and the experts in the expert working groups and so forth to continue to participate as individual observers, which is also permitted under the new regulation. So we've managed to have some kind of interim arrangement to provide continuity. The case of Switzerland is a little bit more complicated and is well above my pay grade, I would say. So as you're aware, there's some political issues between Switzerland and the Union around the institutional framework agreement that has complicated matters. I think from my point of view and from all the BEREC members' point of view, we've highly valued the contribution made by Swiss colleagues to BEREC, and it's been suddenly a mutually beneficial to have them participate, and it would be our great wish that the situation would evolve as quickly as possible so that they can resume participation. I think that's a very strong view, I think not just from me but from all the members of BEREC. Okay.
Just one question. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure.
There's a question from Twitter, but I'm not sure I can answer it. It seems to be based on a misunderstanding. So it's about the conflict of interest in net neutrality, and it says, given that you represent somebody in suing regulatory decisions. Anyway, I'm not going to answer the question because it doesn't seem to be, I don't understand the basis of it. The premise doesn't seem to be correct. Are there any other questions? If not, thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and we look forward to seeing you at the next debrief, or no doubt around the various conferences and other occasions that we have. Thank you very much.